Can everybody hear me?
Yes, sir.
Evie, can you hear me? I want you to hear me. That was a wonderful meal, and I thank you very much. I live in Flagstaff, Arizona. I moved out there in 1961. And we practiced over in Virgilina, which is a little town just north of Oxford, about 20 miles. And I practiced medicine and surgery there for a few years. And my wife got asthma. And boy, she spent about half her time in Duke. So we went out to Arizona. And we've been there for 50 years. Now, when I was a little boy, my mama taught me over here in East Tennessee that a gentleman did not wear a hat at night, especially in a house, except if you're an auctioneer or a cattleman or a public speaker, which I am not. But you ladies are going to have to excuse me because I've got to wear my hat. You see, it's a special hat. Oh, the hat's not special. It's the hat band. That's made by a Navajo Indian about 100 years ago, I would say, hammered out of pure silver. I bought it at the Museum of Northern Arizona from Clay Lockett's collection. And using modern Navajo technology, I have had all my memory and my knowledge encoded in that band, so that when I put it on, it makes connection with my few remaining brain cells. And you will see me adjust it every once in a while if I lose my train of thought. But you'll have to excuse me. Now, I told this down in San Antonio. I was talking to a bunch of vets down there and a bunch of cattlemen. And after I finished my little talk, I was signing books, and this lady came up with her checkbook and her pen, and I said, "Did you want one of my books?" She said, "No, I want one of them hat bands." And I said, "Well, I just told that as a joke." She said, "You did? Well, in that case, I'll take two. One for my husband. He can't remember a thing, and he is a joke." I had this, I was a young fella, and I had this school teacher, and she was teaching me public speaking, and she said, "Now, Henry Wayne," my middle name was Wayne, my wife still calls me Wayne. She went to see a John Wayne movie, and I looked so much like him. She has called me Wayne ever since. Anyway, my teacher said, "Henry Wayne, when you're talking to a group," she said, "you use some big words. Use some words that they won't understand." And she said, "Now that's the group you're pitching to. You will impress them, and they will really be interested in you." She said, for example, tell a story and say that story was a metaphor. Well, I like the sound of that. That story's a metaphor. That story was a metaphor, and I used it. And I told a story down at the Cattlemen's Association at Creek at our annual meeting, and I said that story was a metaphor. And after I finished talking, this little fellow walked up to me and he said, "I enjoyed your story." But he said, "Dr. Poore, that was not a metaphor." I said, "It wasn't?" Now, he had on one of those Indiana Jones hats. He had on a Harris tweed coat and pleated trousers and polished Wellington boots right out of Harvard Community College, you could tell. I got to thinking about that story. metaphor. That's the word, metaphor. So I went home and I got thinking, well, maybe I'm in that group I've been pitching to. Because maybe I didn't know what it meant. I got myself a hardback copy, brand new, unabridged International Webster's Dictionary. And I looked up metaphor, and it said a metaphor is something that is unreal, but is directed toward a person or a thing. And I realized at that point that I was in that group, because the way I used metaphor, I said I went down to Warrington to meet this big old buxom blonde, and I was so old I couldn't remember what I metaphor. And another time, I said that old stallion came down in the pasture, and when that little filly jumped out from behind the bush, he knew what he had come down in the metaphor. So you got to be real careful about those big words. Now, Jimmy called me and said, I wonder if you'd come and talk to our conference meeting, and I said, I'd be glad to. Yeah, and I see a lot of familiar faces, and I've known some of you folks over the years. I said, what do you want me to talk about? He said, well, you're a doctor and I'm a surgeon. We all have a scientific program. He said, for example, how about the osteoporotic syndrome in the postmenopausal female? And he said, bring a lot of slides. He said, after a good prime rib dinner, we love slides with those little bars and little figures you can't read. And I said, no, I'm not going to do that. Those ladies are not in that group. And the men only care about brow growing their own testosterone. So I'm going to tell you a true story. And I'm going to tell you, how many of you in this room know a man named E.B. Harris? Put up your hand. How many of you know him as a loyal member of Warren County community? Good businessman, good, honest man. How many of you? Because I want to tell you a story. And I'm going to ask you the same question at the end of my story. It was in 1965, and I was living in Arizona, and a little farm came up for sale, about 280 acres over in Granville County, and I knew about that farm, and it was sold on silent bid. And so I put in a bid on that farm from Arizona. About a month later, I got a letter from the judge at the Superior Court. Marty said, you bought the farm, send me a check. So all of a sudden, I was living in Arizona, and I had a farm at Oak Hill in Granville County. Well, I've still got it. I traveled back and forth over the years, and when I first got it, I went down to Bill Morris. Anybody remember Mr. Morris that raised pole Herefords over at Jackson? I bought 15, 20 of his good pole Herefords. I was always partial to pole Herefords because my daddy raised pole Herefords and his daddy raised pole Herefords. And so I had pole Herefords, but I got myself a good black bull. And I was so proud of the heifers. I developed a herd of black baldy, half and a half pole Hereford Angus heifers. And they were beautiful. I got 32 of them. Now, keep these dates in mind. 1961, I went to Flagstaff for 61. 65, I bought this farm. And I spent the next 5 or 6 years developing those black baldies. Another little farm came up for sale in the early 70s over on the Virginia line, over at Virginia. And we were fortunate enough that a friend sold it, and we bought that from him. So over the years, my family and I have traveled back and forth, and we have operated those farms while I practiced medicine in Flagstaff. I have moved my black baldy heifers over to my farm in Virginia, 32 of them, and I had some other cows, but my black baldies were my pride and joy. Jimmy, you should have seen them. They were nice. Well, there was a certain man in North Carolina. His first name was Pete, and I'm not going to tell you his second name. But Pete knew that I traveled back and forth, and Mr. Poore was taking care of my farm and keeping it clipped and looking after the cows, and he was a good, honest man. But Pete went over and said, Dr. Poore wants to sell those cattle, those 32 black baldies. And he said, I tell you, you don't have to do one thing to them. You just put them in the barn, and I'll send a truck over to get them. You won't have to help load them. Oh, he said, by the way, Dr. Poore wants to sell that little Ferguson tractor there. And Mr. Poole said, no, I got to go and call Dr. Poore. We need that tractor. I use it every day. And Pete said, don't bother. I'll talk to him about that later. You just get the cattle. Well, I came in about a month later, all excited. I went over, and I said, where are my black baldies? And Mr. Poole said, you sold them. Now, this was in about 1972-73 that I lost my cattle. I said, no, I didn't sell those. And he said, oh, yes, you did. I said, they were loaded up and taken away from you. And I checked all around. I went to the local markets, and I couldn't find my cattle. But I had some others, and I was downhearted and kind of discouraged. But, you know, life goes on. I had some more cattle. A fellow named Billy Murray had a stand of timber beside my place in Virginia. And he cut that timber and he dropped the laps over on my fence. And I had about 5 cows that got out and got in Ed Murray's fresh corn. And Ed Murray didn't like that a bit. And I couldn't get those cattle out. And I said, what am I going to do? And somebody said, well, what you need to do is to call a fellow named E.B. Harris and said he will come and get your cattle up. So I called a Mr. E.B. Harris. And I explained to him my problem, and he said, well, now, Dr. Poe, there ain't no way I can come over there. I've got to haul a load of cattle, but I'm going to send 2 men, and he'll get your cattle up for you. And I said, all right, you go ahead and send me your bill, and I'll pay you. And sure enough, about 2 hours later, trailer pulls in, 2 men with horses and dogs. They got my cattle in, and they fixed my fence. And I never heard a word from E.B. Harris. Not one word. No bill, nothing. That's a pretty nice fellow. Well, about a year later, 2 years maybe, I had a cow that could not calf. And so I couldn't catch her. And what do? I called E.B. Harris. Hey, Dr. Poe. He said, Dr. Poe, there's no way I can come over there. I've got this sale I'm starting to do in the auction business. And, but I'm going to send my men over there. And they come right on over there. And sure enough, here they came. Caught the cow